Chapter 16. An Ambuscade. Sigurd's return to the court of King Thorstein was met with immense joy, as he had been feared lost in a coastal storm before his departure. Halfdan, on the other hand, spent only a week in Dublin before deciding to make his way back home without any further delay. As Sigurd said farewell to Freya, he couldn't help but feel sorrowful. They had grown very close during their travels. Although Leofric and Sigrid remained with him, he knew he would miss her greatly. "Never mind," he promised. "We'll land in Norway this summer or fall, and I'll make sure to turn up at the Danish court, or in Vendland shortly after. I'll be happy to see Vidar again when I get home," Freya replied. "It'll almost be as good as seeing you." Halfdan had informed them of Vidar's safe arrival back home, meaning that Halldor Eirik had stayed true to his word. Sigurd and Leofric accompanied Halfdan's ships for a few miles in their vessel, the Crane, before bidding farewell to Freya and turning back towards Dublin. Sigurd's duties at the court were light, as there were no jarls ruling over the Irish kingdom like there were in Norway. All he had to do was command the courtmen. Leofric, meanwhile, refused to do homage to King Thorstein, as he remained loyal to his own land. However, the king still gave him a command, and Leofric proved himself to be a capable leader. At the start of summer, King Thorstein took all his warships out of the water, scraped the bottoms, and gave them a thorough overhaul. Thorir Clacke, who was still in Dublin, urged the king to set sail for Norway as soon as possible, claiming that bonders would flock to him upon his arrival and that he need not bring a large force. Thorstein understood very well that Thorir was not to be trusted, but he kept it to himself. Later he confided in Sigurd that Thorir was someone who deserved to be hanged. While Sigurd was away in England, two half-brothers of King Thorstein's had been driven from Norway by Halldor Ragnvald and sought refuge with the king in Ireland. Thorir tried to bribe them, but luckily they pretended to agree with him while revealing his plans. Halldor Ragnvald had sent him there, but the king didn't seem too happy about it. With a grim smile he warned, "Thorir will try to kill me on the voyage, but if he fails, Ragnvald has men waiting for me at a certain point on shore. They are instructed to take me out, permanently." Sigurd was outraged, and even the priest Thangbrand growled, "Let me handle him, Thorstein. I guarantee he won't be bothering you again." Thorstein laughed heartily. "Thangbrand, you're better suited for being a Viking than a priest. If I ever conquer Norway, I shall send you to Iceland to spread Christianity." The priest's face lit up at the prospect. "Thank you, my king. It's a shame that such a beautiful island has no churches of Christ. Even if I face resistance, I can handle it." Sigurd laughed at the mixture of warrior and priest in Thangbrand, who had joined forces with Thorstein after being forced out of his home. Although he was deeply religious, it was clear that he was also an ideal candidate to bring Christianity to heathen Iceland. At that time, conversion was a bloody business, and the cross and sword went hand in hand in spreading the faith. The old gods of Norway had many martyrs to their name before Christianity prevailed in later years. Around Dublin, irregular fighting occurred. The Irish kings were constantly trying to reclaim their land from the Norsemen, but were always outgunned by the well-armed Vikings. Thorstein had no problems maintaining law and order for several miles around the city. One day, Thorstein asked Sigurd, "How would you like to visit King Brian Borimhe? I want to make peace with him before I leave Dublin for Norway. I cannot depend on my brother and want to ensure that Dublin is safe for at least a year." "I would be delighted," responded Sigurd, "for I have heard so many tales about the wonders of Ireland's interior that I long to see it with my own eyes." "Very well," replied the king. "I will have letters written in Irish, and you can bring along whomever you wish, along with an interpreter. Be ready to leave on Monday, as I believe the king should be in Kells, a large city about 30 miles to the west. I will provide a trustworthy guide." Thangbrand, the priest, heard about Sigurd's journey and eagerly requested to join him, which was granted graciously by Thorstein. And so on Monday morning, Sigurd, Thangbrand, and 20 men left Dublin. Their weapons were secured peacefully, and they brought along an Irish captive as their guide and interpreter, who promised to guide them to Kells in exchange for his freedom. Sigurd laughed when he saw the priest join them. Thangbrand was wearing a byrnie beneath his robe, a lightweight steel cap on his head, and had a shield and sword attached to his saddlebow. "No one knows what could happen," he responded bravely to Sigurd's laughter. "We may be ambushed by these Irish robbers, or the guide may lead us astray. It's best to be prepared for anything." After a brisk journey, they arrived at the boundary of Thorstein's territory, and then traversed through woods and swamps for about 12 miles. As evening approached, they found themselves at an open plain, which was partially cultivated. The spires and towers of a grand city stood out in the distance. Several times they were stopped by groups of Irishmen, but their guide remained faithful. Sigurd was amazed by the sight of Kells. "This is marvellous!" he exclaimed. "I had no idea that such civilization existed so close to Dublin." Thangbrand chuckled. "Kells rarely falls prey to Viking raids in recent years. It's a fortified city, with an impressive monastery within its walls. I've been here once before and discovered that it's a beautiful land in peacetime, but in war it's nearly impossible to reach the city." As they approached, Sigurd saw that this was true, since defence systems lined either side of the road, and he discovered several stone castles as well. Just as the sun began to set, they entered the gates of Kells, and their guide rushed ahead to arrange lodging for the men. As they made their way through the streets, they were met with scowls and curses from the Irish. The Northmen had given them good reason to hate, having ravaged their lands, destroyed their monasteries, and wreaked havoc upon their once splendid civilization. Had it not been for King Brian's strong hand, they surely would have taken over the entire country. That evening they took up lodging at a grand inn, and the following morning they made their way to the court. King Brian's palace was beyond anything Sigurd had ever seen, even in London. It was built of stone, and the great hall was adorned with an array of arms and tapestries. The nobles that filled the room were dressed much like the Northmen, but their golden bracelets and cloak pins were richly crafted, with the precious metal abounding. Sigurd led his men to the high seat and bowed low to King Brian, a powerful and stern-faced man. He was in his 60s, and opened and read the letters from Thorstein with a frown, then handed them to a monk who stood at his side. "Sir Haldor," he said, without rising as he fixed his grey eyes on Sigurd, "I will have an answer written at once. For now you and your men will stay in my palace here. King Thorstein is a brave and worthy man, and I am pleased to conclude a year's truce with him. If all Northmen were like him, Erin would be a happier land." The monk translated the king's words, and Sigurd withdrew, bowing low. Thangbrand then headed to the monastery, bringing Sigurd along. The monks were somewhat surprised at the warlike appearance of the priest, but entertained them well nonetheless, showing them around the grounds. The next morning King Brian summoned Sigurd once more. He handed him a parchment for King Thorstein, and awarded him a heavy golden arm-ring. The Norsemen quickly departed from the city, making their way back to Thorstein's territory at a good pace. As they reached the borders, Sigurd and Thangbrand rode ahead of the party. Thangbrand, an adept horseman, showed Sigurd how to make his steed curvet and prance, and as they continued, they eventually outpaced the rest of the group. They rounded a curve in the path, twisting below a dense canopy of trees. Suddenly, several men leaped towards their mounts, attempting to seize them by the reins. Meanwhile, others charged at Sigurd and Thangbrand, trying to wrench them from their saddles. Although they struggled to retrieve their weapons, attackers descended from the treetops and overwhelmed them. Within moments, the two Vikings were tightly bound, helpless, and dragged off into the inky depths of the forest. Chapter 17. Thorkel turns up. In the distance, faint shouts and the sound of horns trailed behind them as the group moved on from where their leaders had been ambushed. Eventually, it became silent. Sigurd noticed that they were being transported by a band of 24 Irishmen who were making their way north through the forest. He started to say something to the priest at his side, but one of their captors forcefully struck him on the mouth, speaking sharply in Irish. Sigurd stopped talking. As darkness fell, the group stopped beside a stream. Sigurd guessed they had travelled several miles from where they were taken. A fire was started, where the Irishmen cooked their meal. The two prisoners were flung down beneath a large tree. "What foolishness to leave our guide," grumbled Thangbrand, his thick black beard covering most of his face. "I wish they would give us food." Their wish was granted, as the leader of the group approached them, cutting their ropes, giving them bread and meat, and a horn of water from the stream. But soon after, they were bound again. "They seem to be waiting for someone," Sigurd exclaimed. "Did you see the leader send men out in all directions?" Indeed, the leader had sent men out as soon as they had arrived, and an hour later, a second group of men emerged into the firelight with a shout. Sigurd cried out in surprise as he recognized Thorkel Gormson at the front, whom he had left in London the previous winter. The new arrivals were also Irishmen, except for Thorkel. The leader of the original group welcomed Thorkel, and, to Sigurd's surprise, Thorkel handed him a bag that jingled pleasantly. Thorkel then stepped forward to Sigurd's side. "So I finally have you, Lord Haldor," he exclaimed, his dark eyes filled with malice. "It's quite a distance from London to Ireland, but I have waited and watched patiently." "It's a pity that I didn't hit you harder that night," retorted Sigurd. "What is your objective with this attack?" Thorkel laughed harshly. "You're going with me to Haldor Ragnvald, my dear fellow. As for this follower of the White Christ, I think I'll hand him over to my friends in the morning." Sigurd paled, aware that any Norseman caught by the Irish would face a gruesome fate. Thangbrand, however, defiantly yelled, "Release me, traitor, and face me with blade in hand." Thorkel scoffed. "I thought followers of your god were docile and submissive, willing to die for their beliefs." Thangbrand reddened with shame and let out no further retort. Thorkel then turned his back, posted guards, and soon the group slumbered peacefully under the tree cover. Though the Norsemen had not been stripped of their weapons, their bindings left them useless. Sigurd, however, noticed his sword's peace tie had been ripped off in the forest's rush. An hour later, Thangbrand nudged Sigurd's hand with his own. Lying side by side, unbound, and with a snoozing guard a few feet away, Thangbrand gestured to the sheathed sword. Sigurd cautiously rolled on his stomach and edged the weapon close enough for the priest. Thangbrand faced the other way, and his groping fingers finally met the hilt. Just in time, the guard strolled over to check on the sleepers, and Sigurd heard a barely audible noise when Thangbrand cut his bonds. When the sentry hovered over Sigurd to ensure everything was still in place, Thangbrand quickly overpowered the unsuspecting guard. Swiftly muzzling and capturing the sentry, Thangbrand then freed Sigurd, whispering through his own stiff lips, "If only my hands weren't so numb, I'd have done better." Still struggling with their own numbness, the companions broke free, and Thangbrand questioned, "Which way, Haldor?" "Westerly, Thangbrand," answered Haldor. "Once we encounter any of King Brian's men, we'll be safe. He has a bracelet recognizable in these parts, and you are a priest, which will both prove helpful." Silently, Sigurd and Thangbrand gathered their shields from the sleeping men and slipped away into the inky darkness of the forest. The moon was rising, casting a pale glow on their path, giving them just enough light to move quickly. They ran for what seemed like an eternity, the trees blurring past them. Sigurd knew they had to move quickly, navigate the rough terrain, and put as much distance between themselves and their pursuers as possible. Finally, after what felt like hours, Thangbrand signaled for a break. They both collapsed, gasping for air. Thangbrand was panting heavily, and Sigurd knew he couldn't keep up the pace much longer. As they caught their breath, Sigurd wondered if they would be pursued. Thangbrand was resolute, gritting his teeth and promising to fight to the death rather than fall into their hands. They continued on, taking turns walking and running. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they saw that the forest was thinning out, giving way to cultivated fields. They hoped they were getting closer to safety. A faint yell rang out behind them, and Sigurd knew that they were not alone. They had to pick up their pace, running for their lives. Thangbrand was running out of energy, but Sigurd refused to leave him behind. Finally, Thangbrand stopped, exhausted. "Go on, Fairhair," he said. "Your life is worth more than mine. I'll hold them off as long as I can." Sigurd hesitated for a moment, but he knew that Thangbrand was right. He had to get to safety, and he had to do it quickly. With a heavy heart, he ran on, hoping that his only friend in this strange land would somehow survive. Sigurd spoke calmly. "One of the rules of Jomsborg is to never abandon a comrade." Thangbrand erupted. "Forget your Jomsborg rules. Go, and make haste." Sigurd interjected. "Listen, do you hear that horn?" In the distance, they could hear the faint sound of a war horn coming from the west, and from behind them, the sound of their pursuers drawing closer. "Quickly, Fairhair," Thangbrand commanded, drawing his sword. "Go and seek help while I hold them off." Sigurd unsheathed his own sword and smiled at Thangbrand's generosity. "Enough of this foolishness," Sigurd said, though the excitement of battle coursed through him. "Let's take our stand by that massive oak tree where we can fight without fear of being attacked from behind." They positioned themselves on either side of the towering oak tree, just as the first pursuer arrived. Within minutes, a circle of armed men surrounded them. Thorkel, the leader of the Irish, bravely led a charge of 12 men straight towards the tree. The combat began with furious intensity. The Irish came at them with long knives, but were quickly repelled by the deadly blows of Thangbrand and Sigurd. As the Irish retreated, their chief ordered a barrage of arrows. Sigurd deflected one arrow with his shield and sliced the second arrow in half in mid-flight. The Irish onlookers were amazed by the display of precision and skill from the Norsemen. Thangbrand replicated Sigurd's feat, but despite their efforts, they were eventually wounded by the onslaught of arrows. Suddenly, Thorkel leaped at Sigurd with a shout of impatience. The Irish circled around the combat with bated breath, observing every move, while Thangbrand protected Sigurd's back. Thorkel and Sigurd clashed blades 3 times. Then, seeing an opening, Sigurd lunged forward, only to lose his footing on the dewy grass, and fell head first onto the ground. Thangbrand found himself on top of his enemy, towering over Thorkel. The Irish warriors, wielding their sharp knives, stood behind Thangbrand, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The priest engaged in a heated sword fight with Thorkel. Suddenly Thorkel flung his arms up, disturbed by something flying past Thangbrand. A spear landed in Thorkel's body, and his followers screamed in horror. As Thangbrand glanced around, helping Sigurd stand up, he noticed King Brian Boroimi sneaking up behind him, brandishing his own sword. The king's men were swarming the scene, chasing down the frightened enemy soldiers in all directions and taking no mercy in killing them. Chapter 18. A Mission for the King. Speaking in Latin, the king's voice boomed across the room. Thangbrand recognized the language. He had been traveling with the king's men, and they had just returned after a recent mishap. The king was not pleased, but he greeted them warmly nonetheless. "We owe you our lives, my lord," Thangbrand replied, grateful for their safe return. "Strange words for a man of God, Sir Priest," the king laughed, "but I see that your blade has done good service to Haldor Sigurd. Perhaps in these times a priest must be a man of the world as well." Thangbrand shot a glance at Sigurd, who held up the king's unbroken letters. They were safe, and the king's men had returned to escort them to Kells. Sigurd was in a hurry to get back to Dublin, so the king granted him an escort of 50 men. As they rode through the land of Thorstein, Sigurd dismissed the Irish, and they surged forward, eager to reach their destination. But as the city came into view, Sigurd was struck with dismay. Instead of the king's standard, a giant black banner floated ominously from the castle. Puzzled, they rode closer and discovered that the shops were all closed, and the whole city was shrouded in mourning. Without hesitation, Sigurd excused himself and hurried to the great hall. Inside, he found Thorstein sitting in the high seat, his head bowed low. Sigurd handed over the king's letters and asked, "Why is the black standard raised, and why is the city in mourning?" Thorstein looked up slowly, his eyes heavy with sorrow. "Welcome back, Haldor. In an evil hour. Queen Gyda died last night." Sigurd was shocked by the news. The king slowly rose from his seat, approached Sigurd, and took his arm, saying, "Sigurd, come and talk to me. I am lonely, and the most wretched of all men." As they paced up and down the hall, Thorstein confided in Sigurd about the tragic events of the previous night. The queen had fallen ill, and despite the best efforts of Sigurd, a skilled healer, she still passed away. The king was consumed with grief and anger, asking why such an evil would befall him. Sigurd listened patiently to Thorstein's outburst, letting him express his pain. Then in a soft voice, Sigurd reminded the king that it was the will of God. Perhaps this adversity was meant to test Thorstein's devotion to spreading the word in heathen Norway. Thorstein knew this was true, but still found it hard to accept. He had been blessed with good fortune until now, and he struggled to bear the weight of this misfortune. However, he knew that if God wanted him to focus on spreading his gospel, then he had no choice but to obey. For many months, Thorstein was consumed by his grief over the loss of his beloved queen. 2 days later, she was laid to rest, and Thorstein threw himself into preparing for the expedition to Norway. It was a daunting task. Thorstein had 12 warships in the harbour, but he couldn't take such a large force. In case he succeeded in Norway, Thorstein planned to leave his Irish land to his brother-in-law, Thorstein Kvaran, but he needed men to defend it. After consulting with Sigurd and his other chiefs, the king decided to take only the 5 largest ships, which were designed to accommodate about 75 men each. Thorir Clacka, who had no idea that Thorstein was aware of his treacherous intentions, suggested that they launch a surprise attack on Haldor Ragnvald at Hlidskjalf before he could gather his men. Thorir hoped to kill Thorstein during the voyage, or that Ragnvald's men at Agdenes in Norway would eliminate Thorstein before he could put the plan into action. Thorstein had a mission, and that was to spread the word of God to all who would listen. And as fate would have it, the Orkneys were in his path. It was there that he hoped to visit Haldor Sigurd, a powerful man whose fate could determine the success of Thorstein's expedition. As Thorstein's 6 ships sailed into Asmundar Bay in Ronwald Island, they spotted a single ship at anchor. It was a sight to behold. The ship was magnificent, and its furnishings were fit for a king. Thorstein saw an opportunity and sent Sigurd Fairhair to fetch the commander of the ship, hoping to gather news about Norway. To his amazement, the commander turned out to be none other than Haldor Sigurd Lodvarsson himself. Thorstein greeted him warmly, musing, "It seems Sigurds abound here. Yourself, my own Haldor Sigurd Fairhair, good Bishop Sigurd of England, and perhaps a score of my men all sharing the same name." Haldor was unsure of Thorstein's intentions, not knowing where the king was headed or what he wanted. Thorstein urged Haldor to be baptized, but Haldor refused, stating that the faith of his fathers was enough for him. In response, Thorstein raised a sword in one hand and a cross in the other, making Haldor a proposal. "As the king of Norway, I claim all the lands that the kings of Norway have possessed, including those you hold as Haldor of the Orkneys. You have two options. Accept the true faith and be baptized along with your subjects, and I will let you keep the jarldom you now possess. And more importantly, you can hope to reign forevermore in a more magnificent kingdom than this. The second option is that you die, and after your death I will come through the islands and help the people believe in the true God. Now, Haldor, it is your choice. Choose wisely." Haldor was caught in a dilemma, but he decided to make a choice. Slowly he reached out for the cross that Thorstein held, and soon after Bishop Sigurd baptized him. The crews celebrated with joyful shouts, and Haldor's fate was sealed, along with the fate of the Orkneys. He pledged his loyalty to King Thorstein and surrendered his son Hundi, who was also baptized, as a hostage on board Thorstein's vessel headed for Norway. The following day, Thorstein approached Sigurd with another urgent task that required a trusted and dependable messenger. "Sigurd," Thorstein addressed him, "would you undertake yet another mission for me? You always manage to get by, no matter what the circumstance, and as this task holds particular importance, I can think of no one more qualified to handle it." Sigurd chuckled. "If I've made it through some precarious situations, Thorstein, it's not solely because of my own efforts. I've been lucky enough to have loyal companions, and for the rest, God has favored me. But tell me, what is this mission you speak of?" Chapter 19, at King Harald's court. Freya and Halfdan's voyage home to Denmark was safe and uneventful, but upon their arrival they were greeted with a land much changed by the winter. The once religious and peaceful Queen Gunhild had died, and without her restraining him, King Harald was preparing to invade England with his assembled forces. Freya returned to the castle where she lived a solitary life. Her parents were long gone, and her only company was her uncle Halfdan. She found little joy in the presence of the moody and ambitious King Harald. However, when the king placed his two sons, Harald and Canute, under her care, she took great interest in their upbringing. The younger boy eventually grew up to become a great and worthy king of England, thanks largely to Freya, who had raised him well. As the summer progressed, men gathered and were dispatched to the Danish settlements in the northern regions of England to await the king's arrival in the fall. Halfdan was sent in command of one of these detachments, leaving Freya even more alone than before. One day, King Harald summoned Freya to the hall where he was surrounded by his chiefs. He informed her that the son of King Vladimir of Russia had sought her hand in marriage, and that he had accepted the offer on her behalf. He explained that not only was it a great honor, but it would add a fleet of ships to his army from Russia. Freya was overwhelmed by the news, but she responded bravely. She told the king that he had no right to dispose of her hand in this fashion. She also reminded him that she was not his subject and that her lands lay in Vendland. She even threatened to appeal to King Borislav for protection from this outrage. The king's face darkened with anger, telling Freya that she was to do as she was told. He reminded her that he was king and that even King Borislav would do his bidding. He exclaimed that it was unheard of for a girl to make decisions with regard to her own marriage. A low murmur of agreement echoed among the chiefs, causing Freya to despair as she gazed desperately around the circle of fierce faces. She longed for her kind uncle to stand by her side. But, as the king had pointed out, in those days a girl hardly had any say on whom she wanted to marry. It was the parents or guardians who decided, and they did so without consulting the young woman. This left Freya feeling helpless. "This is an honorable match," the king continued calmly, "so let's put an end to this protest. You will depart for Gardarika, Vladimir's capital, in 2 weeks with a suitable escort." With that, the girl was dismissed to her chambers. Young Canute, upon learning of the matter, tried to comfort her, but he was just as powerless as she was. Therefore, despite her resolution to never marry, even if she had to flee her home, the packing of her belongings proceeded. A week went by, and as Freya sat sewing in the garden, a great commotion arose from the harbour. There were shouts and war horns mixed with the clashing of arms. She sent Canute to investigate. The boy returned not long after with his eyes shining and cheeks flushed with excitement. "Oh, Freya!" he exclaimed. "We have guests! 2 enormous ships just sailed into the harbour from a far-off land. The strangest ships. Instead of dragons in the bows, they had large gilt crosses. All the men have shields adorned with red crosses, and when I saw them disembark, I saw fierce and mighty warriors among them." Freya turned pale upon hearing the news. What ships could these be, sailing beneath the cross, if not— Canute continued excitedly. "And Freya, you must see their leaders. One old Viking was so fierce and audacious, and a dazzling young woman with bright golden hair, and a lad who must be her brother. But above them is a young man with hair like sunlight streaming over his shoulders, and a magnificent golden helmet." Freya didn't stay to hear the rest. Abandoning her needlework, she raced toward her rooms, her heart pounding. Quickly summoning her handmaids, she adorned herself, then rushed to the deserted great hall. Dashing outside, she left the fortress and made her way to the harbour. The town square was bustling with the locals and the castle's men, creating a path for Freya to pass through. King Harold was amidst a group of people she couldn't see because of the swelling crowd. As she navigated through the throng, a familiar voice caught her ear, and suddenly she was face to face with Sigurd Fairhair. "Freya!" he exclaimed in delight. He then took her hands and held them tightly. "Sigurd," she replied, noticing how much he had grown. "You've become a big man already. I'm so happy to see you, and I really need you too," she confided in a lower voice. Sigurd gave her a quick, concerned look, then turned to shout, "Here, Leofric! Sigrid!" Within moments the 2 girls were embracing each other while the onlooking crowd stood by, stunned. Sigurd recounted their entire tale to King Harold, who then ordered everyone to follow him to the castle. "Let's talk in peace there," he said. "Come up right away. My men will take care of your ship so your warriors can be entertained at the barracks." Sigurd left the arrangements to Bjorn, and the 4 young friends followed King Harold to the castle. They settled in the hall below the high seat, where King Harold asked, quite curiously, "Now how in the world did you all end up here?" King Harold surely remembered Sigurd and was interested in their story. In return, Sigurd told him about Leofric and Sigrid's rescue. Harold nodded. "I know that story. Haldor Alfwick is with my army in England even now. Please continue. King Thorstein sent Leofric and his sister to you to request that they be taken to their father. If not that, then they were to be provided with a pilot who could take them safely to Flanders. But since you are planning on heading to England soon, that matter is settled," Sigurd continued. "I'll be overjoyed to have Haldor Alfwick's son with me," replied the king reassuringly. "They'll be safe until they reach Haldor." "As for myself," said Sigurd before he could finish, cries of amazement rung out from the Danes. Harold leapt up, shouting, "King Thorstein has sailed for Norway! Skål! Skål!" The chiefs around him echoed his cheer. "He sent me to you to ask that, if possible, you send him ships and men. Or if you cannot do this, that at least you will not aid Haldor Ragnvald and Haldor Eirik," said Sigurd. "As for the first request, I cannot do that. I need every man I can raise. But be sure to let Thorstein know that he does not have to worry about an attack from me. I will be joyful indeed when the traitor Ragnvald is driven from Norway," replied Harold. "That will be good news for Thorstein, for an attack in the rear would be fatal. He only has 5 ships, one of which is mine. His success will depend entirely on his being able to surprise Ragnvald," said Sigurd. Sigurd then told the story of how Thorstein had Christianized the Orkneys, and how he had dispatched him immediately on this journey. Thorstein was to remain for 3 weeks in the islands, baptizing the people. He had arranged to meet Sigurd at Moster, an island on the west coast of Norway, for which Thorstein would direct his course. Sigurd had no opportunity to speak with Freya until the evening. He was puzzled by her words that morning. Not until Leofric, Sigrid, and he went to her apartments in the evening did he receive an explanation. Freya told them about Harold's plans for her marriage. "It is a shame," exclaimed Sigrid. "In England, a girl must yield obedience to her father's wishes, but she is not forced into marrying in this way." Sigurd was silent, his brows knitted. "I am in a bad position," he said at last. "Of course the simplest way out would be for you to come on board the Crane, and for us to join King Thorstein. But I am on a mission here that I cannot neglect. I cannot anger Harold against Thorstein as such an action would do. Not that I care for my own sake, but it might mean ruin to my king." Leofric agreed with him. "Yes, you must consider your duty to Thorstein, yet there are 2 sides to it." Sigurd shook his head, ending off the discussion. "No," he said firmly, "there are not. At any cost, Harold's finger must be kept out of Thorstein's pie. He's liable to abandon his English trip and turn all his forces against Norway in a sudden fit of rage. That would be fatal to Thorstein at present." "I think I have a plan," Sigrid said after a pause. "As long as you don't appear in Freya's escape, it will be all right, won't it?" Sigurd nodded, intrigued. "Well then, give Wolfe a few men and that cutter that's on the Snake. Let them take Freya on board, and wait for you at some place along the coast. You must leave tomorrow or the next day to rejoin Thorstein, so you can pick them up as you go, and King Harold will think Freya has fled of her own will." "Good!" cried Sigurd. "What can you say about the plan, Freya?" "I think it's a good one, too," replied the girl, her dark eyes sparkling. "But all my things are packed up, and I don't want to meet King Thorstein looking like this." She blushed as a peal of laughter went up from the rest. "Never mind, Freya," laughed Sigrid. "I will put a chest aboard the Crane tonight. My things will fit you pretty well, and King Thorstein gave me a whole shipload of dresses." "Better put it in the cutter," said Leofric, "for when Harold finds his ward gone, he will search our ships first thing." And so it was arranged that the next night, Wolfe, who had firmly attached himself to the young Haldor, should wait at the dock for Freya, who insisted on making her way down to the harbour alone.